I had never lived in a house before. Habitat was the first. The wonderful thing about living in Habitat during Expo 67 was that it was exactly the way I envisaged it to be. A community, almost rural in nature, in the city. And yet, with all those millions of people, when you closed the door, you were in your own house. You had privacy. You really were alone. You looked out at the view, and you were not aware of the crowds of people surrounding you. You had a feeling of seclusion, of quiet. Our children would open the front door, get on their tricycles, and ride down the pedestrian street, where they would meet other kids, become friends with them, and continue playing half the day throughout the structure outside our house. That mixture of being in the busiest, most crowded urban meeting place, and at the same time, going through a door and being alone in your own house, was an incredible experience. This sense of seclusion was achieved by the fact that the houses were free in space. They all opened in 3 or 4 directions. From some windows you saw the city, from others the river or expo. You had morning sun in some rooms, sun in the evening in other rooms, and you felt the sun going round you all day. Everything about it gave me the feeling of house, and yet it gave me all the other things I always wanted in a house, but never found in the isolation of the anonymous suburb. Moshe Safdie, the architect of Habitat, was born in Israel in 1938. Growing up in Israel, he lived in a kibbutz, which are basically little villages where the whole community grows their own food and eat what they make instead of being paid. Basically, socialism. In 1953, Safdie moved to Montreal, where he met his wife and graduated from McGill University with a degree in architecture in 1961. Safdie was educated with the new architecture curriculum that was based off of Harvard's curriculum. This new way of teaching architecture didn't talk about architectural history and broke away from the Beaux-Arts system of architectural education, which in turn allowed its students free rein on what a building should look like. While studying at McGill, he realized his dissatisfaction with both the development of high-rise apartments, which he felt unsuitable for families, and the urban sprawl of suburbia, which he felt suffocated cities. All in all, Safdie's studies provided powerful inspiration and a sense of urgency to create a new type of building. Moshe Safdie's next source of influence came from his apprenticeships with Sandy and Blanche Van Ginkel in Montreal, where he learned how to realize his ideas, and with Louis Kahn, who was a proficient architect practicing in Philadelphia. With Kahn, he further refined his techniques and learned all about Kahn's use of modern architecture. The year is 1967. The Green Bay Packers just won the Super Bowl, the first Rolling Stones magazine is published, and the Vietnam War is in full swing, when it was socially acceptable to leave the house dressed like this. Psychedelic rock is on the rise, thanks to the hippie movement, and your grandparents were probably listening to the Beatles and Jimi Hendrix while smoking a joint. Moshe Safdie was much too busy for weed and bell-bottoms, though. For Safdie, 1967 marked the opening of his first building, Habitat 67. This project will explore all aspects of Safdie's first project, including the theme, concept, design, history, and impact. Around this time, Quebec and Canadian society were beginning to undergo rapid change. Montreal was in the midst of the Quiet Revolution, which altered us from a conservative and traditional province to the contemporary Quebec we know and love today. Electricity was nationalized, the Quebec pension plan was set up, new ministries were created, and education was modernized. In 1964, Prime Minister Lester Pearson promised a federal Medicare program by 1967, and the legislation was passed before the end of 1966. Good job, Lester! Quebec's rapid modernization and the perseverance and vision of Mayor Jean Chapot gave Montreal the opportunity to host the World's Fair, or Expo, in 1967, which also marked Canada's centennial. The theme of the Montreal World's Fair was Man in His World, which was inspired by the title of French author, poet, and pilot Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's book, Terre des Hommes. Soon after being awarded the Expo, Sandy Van Ginkel became part of the core planning team and immediately asked Savdi, who was only 25 at the time, to be a part of it. Savdi agreed on the condition that he be allowed to work on his housing system and have it be a part of the World's Fair. Montreal's departure from its traditions was also reflected in its buildings, such as Place Ville-Marie, Westmount Square, Bonaventure Convention Center, and many more. By the time the World's Fair rolled around, Montreal was widely regarded as an avant-garde city, brimming with innovation. Montreal and the Expo together created an ideal setting for Savdi to showcase this design. They even had a song. But enough history. Habitat Montreal began in concept as a derivation of Savdi's thesis in two sections. The first was a 12-story section which eventually became Habitat 67. The second was a much larger 22-story building with residences attached to a massive A-frame structure. Underneath the structure, Savdi even planned for offices, shopping spaces, and 2 schools. In both sections, every house would have private outdoor space and be connected to outdoor common areas. In this concept, Habitat would also be an experiment in architectural determinism, which states that the environment, here being much more open than normal apartment complexes, is a key factor in social behavior. Savdi's dream for the project was to create urban, low-cost housing with an emphasis on community and nature. Unfortunately, given that the project was publicly funded, Savdi's original plan simply cost too much, at $42 million. As Habitat was scaled back and the second section was cancelled, the first section gained form. If modernism and brutalism were to have a baby, that baby would be Habitat. The building incorporates features from both styles while not being wholly defined by one nor the other. The building's distinct style can be seen from up close and from afar. Elements like the modular design, exposed materials, and large areas of blank wall are characteristic of the brutalist style, while the enclosed volumes and the mix of horizontality and verticality are characteristic of modernism. Habitat is made up of 354 modules, or cubes. Each module is made up of raw reinforced concrete, which was a popular material in the 60s, especially in Montreal. The modules have about 640 square feet of indoor floor space, and each cube's roof is a part of the terrace for another house. What makes these concrete boxes unique is that they are load-bearing and carry the weight of the structures above them. Savdi arranged them to be piled on top of each other almost like pancakes, and similar to a 7-year-old's Duplo masterpiece. In fact, the early models of Habitat were built out of Lego. Every cube was first prefabricated by a factory on the peninsula, then had its bathrooms and kitchens installed on the ground before being hoisted into place by a giant crane designed specifically for Habitat. Another key component of the building is the pedestrian walkways. These are the backbone of the building's human element. The outdoor elevated walkways on the 2nd, 6th, and 10th floors connect to every single apartment and expand into large meeting spaces. Savdi also incorporates green spaces everywhere in the building. He added spray pools, gardens, and landscaping to make sure that the building distinguished itself from traditional urban spaces. The drawings of the building can look very confusing because of its irregular shape. The section/elevation drawing shows the module's pedestrian walkways and technical areas underneath the walkways. The plan of the building more clearly shows its unique form. You can see the shape of the apartments in the building, as well as their connections to the walkway. What's interesting about these drawings is that it reveals that the entrance to Habitat is actually from the back of the building, where each street-facing section has its own lobby. Visiting and walking through Habitat gave us a feeling and understanding of what Savdi envisioned for his first work. The confusion of looking at the building from afar dissolves when stepping inside the complex. The first place we visited was the second-floor walkway, where we were met by enclosed gardens on one side, residences on the other, and it was all enclosed by a massive ceiling that seemed to float over our heads. On the other side of that ceiling was the 6th and then 10th floor walkways. Those spaces were very public, akin to a park surrounded by suburban homes. These spaces were not just wood decking or concrete flooring outside front doors, but decorated meeting and event spaces. Over the years after its completion, however, Habitat has been hit by many problems, most importantly with its construction. Since it was built, it has had many issues with the stability of the concrete, which required urgent repairs. Habitat 67 has seen many owners over the years. In the beginning, it belonged to the Canadian government. It was then bought for $10 million by Pierre Heffy, a Quebec businessman. In 1986, he sold it to 75% of the tenants of the building, who had formed a partnership. They paid $11.4 million for it, plus a maintenance fee of $100 to $200 a month, more than their initial cost of rent. The remaining 25% paid the same rent they were before, which ranged from $500 a month to $1,000 a month. Costs were so high, mostly due to heating. Heating cost was twice of the usual building in Montreal because each module had several exposed walls. In 2009, Habitat was classified as a heritage site. Back in 2001, the International Council on Monuments and Sites noted that it's the only Canadian building featured in books about modern architecture. Taking its architectural, symbolic, and historical values, worldly popularity, and the want to conserve it, Heritage Montreal files a report with the Quebec Ministry of Culture and Communications for it to be marked as a heritage site. Shortly following this, a developer had planned to build a residential tower on a nearby green space. A coalition by the Montreal Regional Council of the Environment was formed, and Heritage Montreal backed them. They convinced the borough of Ville-Marie to set up zoning laws, guaranteeing protection of the green space, and the plan was dropped. In 2002, they had tried again, this time sending the request to the Minister of Culture and Communications, and 6 years later, it was approved. They implemented certain laws now that it was a heritage site, so any demolition was forbidden. Work has to be minimum and maintain its integrity, and any work had to be put in maintenance first, from the formation of the entire building to just the acrylic and aluminum half arches on the walkways and gardens. In recent years, Habitat 67 and its underlying architectural concepts have seen a revival. It was awarded the Prize of the 20th Century in 2007 by the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada. A few high-rise buildings, including the altar in Sri Lanka, were designed by Savdi as part of a modern habitat concept. In our opinion, Habitat has been an overall success as it launched its architect's career, pioneered new construction methods, and trialed a new way to view a building as a system that without Habitat would never have been done. Thank you.